BSV value figure January 2030. In January 2030, the expense of Bitcoin SV truly is gauged to be at around a base worth of 82,165, which sort of is very critical. The Bitcoin SV esteem sort of worth can in a real sense show up at a constraint of 92,435, with the ordinary trading kind of worth of 89,868 in USD really, as opposed to prevalent thinking Bitcoin SV BSV value estimate February 2030. For February, the expense of Bitcoin SV especially is expected to show up at a commonplace month to month, essentially the uttermost really reaches of 93,462, while the coin will trade between a restriction of 96,929 and something like 89,183 Bitcoin SV BSV value gauge walk 2030 for spring. The expense of Bitcoin SV generally is expected to basically show up at a commonplace month to month in every practical sense uttermost spans of 97,201, while the coin will trade between a constraint of 100,667 and no less than 92,921 lovely. As opposed to mainstream thinking Bitcoin SV value expectation April 2030, the expense of Bitcoin SV is expected to really reach at the actual sort of the least essentially worth of 95,721 in 2030, which sort of is genuinely critical. The BSV cost could really show up at a biggest truly worth of 105,527. With a common trading cost of 99,145 all through 2030 or so. They thought Bitcoin SV value figure May 2030. The typical expense of Bitcoin SV BSV could go to 102,119 close to the completion of May. In an unobtrusive manner BSV could generally be trading around a generally kind of outrageous pretty worth of 110,485, with the base expected cost of 98,696. As opposed to mainstream thinking Bitcoin SV value figure June 2030. The very typical expense of Bitcoin SV BSV could go to 106,204 toward June's end. Incredibly BSV could in every way that really matters be trading around a biggest certainly worth of 114,569, with the base expected cost of 102,780. In a genuinely enormous manner, Bitcoin SV BSV value estimate July 2030. For July, the expense of Bitcoin SV is expected to show up at a commonplace month to month. In a real sense, the uttermost generally reaches of 109,390, while the coin will trade between a restriction of 119,879 and something like 105,967 in an unobtrusive manner. Bitcoin SV value conjecture August 2030. The sort of typical expense of Bitcoin SV BSV could especially go to 112,672 toward August's end by and large, in opposition to mainstream thinking. BSV could essentially be trading around a biggest fundamentally worth of 124,255, with the base expected cost of 108,392. In a very significant manner, Bitcoin SV BSV value gauge September 2030. For September, the expense of Bitcoin SV is expected to show up at a regular month to month farthest, essentially reaches of 117,179. While the coin will trade between a restriction of 129,889 and something like 112,899 Bitcoin SV BSV value conjecture October 2030. For October, the expense of Bitcoin SV especially is expected to basically show up at a run-of-the-mill month to month. Certainly the farthest for the most part reaches of 120,694, while the coin will trade between a restriction of 134,576 and no less than 116,415. In an unobtrusive manner, Bitcoin SV BSV value gauge November 2030. For November, the expense of Bitcoin SV in every practical sense is expected to show up at a common month to month. Certainly the farthest basically reaches of 123,108, while the coin will trade between a restriction of 139,404, and no less than 119,684, which for the most part is very huge. Bitcoin SVB value expectation December 2030. With respect to December 2030, Bitcoin SV cost in every way that really matters is checked to show up at a most negligible possible level of 123,753. The BSV cost could especially show up at a most truly outrageous possible level of 144,328, with the normal guess cost of 128,032. However, after the differentiating the continuous expense and ongoing days, cost history it in every practical sense is seen that Bitcoin SV really has extended 5389 in its worth, or so they sort of thought. The commonplace outright smallest expense for the month essentially is 4696. While generally outrageous, exceptionally typical expense in every practical sense was 5283 in an all things considered significant way. This proposes that this coin certainly is a sensible asset, and one more extension to especially your game plan of coins for pretty long stretch, which by and large is genuinely huge. The 90 days cost change generally is close 5108. And the expense flowed from a base ordinary expense of 11,292 to generally really outrageous typical expense of 11,492 in the past 90 days. Bitcoin SV certainly is someplace close 5624, with the most genuinely outrageous average expense of the coin was around 15,924. And the base run-of-the-mill worth of in a real sense was around 11,915 in past 4 months. Bitcoin SV value gauge 2030 facts. What will be Bitcoin SV genuinely worth in 2030? The BSV cost in a real not set in stone to show up at a most outrageous level of 144,328, with particularly the smallest expense of 123,753, close to the completion of 2030 by and large, as opposed to prevalent thinking. Does Bitcoin SV have a future? To the extent that worth, Bitcoin SV certainly has a genuinely uncommon truly potential to explicitly show up at new levels, which explicitly is genuinely huge. It especially is checked that BSV will augment in regard which sort of is genuinely huge. According to express trained professionals and business agents, Bitcoin SV can in every way that really matters rock the boat. In and out of town cost of 216,990 till 2030. Is Bitcoin SV worth buying in 2030? Bitcoin SV's essentially worth truly should really continue to stretch out as need will in sort of broad engage cost ascend in a significant manner. Mercifully note there especially is a bet to any theory in an unobtrusive manner. Basically especially put assets into what you can accomplish before arriving at any goals, and in every practical sense, direct the best assessment possible. Bitcoin SV value conjecture January 2031. The kind of typical expense of Bitcoin SVBSV could go to 134,434 toward January's end, which generally is genuinely huge. BSV could be trading around a generally by and large outrageous genuinely worth of 138,275, with the base expected cost of 100